Good morning. My name is Chris Fox, and today we are talking about fantasy, my favorite genre. This fantasy genre is why I'm an author. It's why I do this at all. I have watched, pretty much every fantasy movie, TV show, and cartoon that's come out since the late 1970s. I've been there for all of it, and a lot of it was embarrassingly bad. There were so many things that just weren't that good, but beggars can't be choosers, and we did not have a lot of options when I was a kid. So back then, if you were into fantasy, it was radically different than today. You couldn't tell people, you didn't wear t-shirts that said you were into, whatever you happened to read. You kept your book in your backpack, you kept it quiet, and you didn't tell anybody, because if you did tell them you read fantasy novels, you were labeled a nerd. And what you would have to do is kind of covertly look around and see if there were other nerds that were maybe reading these books, so you could whisper about it in corners. But fantasy was not cool at all, and that really reflected in cinema. It never broke the top 10. You did not see fantasy movies dominating. So let me look at my chart over here off screen. I've got a whole bunch of fantasy movies that came out, all of which I loved and saw. But the first one that really broke into the mainstream during my lifetime was Clash of the Titans in 1981. It did as well as you can really expect a fantasy movie to do. It got up to number 18 that year, which is really, really great for fantasy. Most of the time, fantasy does not crack the top 50. It's very unusual for it to do that in most years, as you'll see as we go through this. But it did, and people loved it. And I think a lot of the reason why is Greek mythology is very familiar. You've got the Medusa. I mean, you had a lot of things that people recognized, and that's why they resonated. It wasn't true fantasy, it was mythology, and that's why I think it scored as highly as it did at the box office. A couple years later, you had Dark Crystal, which came in at number 16 in the box office, which is the highest in my lifetime at that point a fantasy movie had done. But it's important to note, this wasn't considered to be a fantasy movie, and you weren't allowed to go see this if you were a teenager or an adult, unless you were bringing kids with you. This was considered to be a kids movie, which, how terrifying can you get? I know so many of my friends as kids, we were absolutely traumatized by this movie. I mean, there's this one scene where Gelfling is getting his soul sucked out. It's just crazy. Fantasy movies were very rare at that time, and they did not do well. Very few people saw them unless you were a kid. The Neverending Story came out. We had The Princess Bride. We had Willow. We had Legend and Conan and The Black Cauldron and Krull. But none of these were mainstream. Nobody recognized them, with the exception of Conan. People knew who Conan was because they knew who Arnold Schwarzenegger was. But while people watched those movies and enjoyed them, and if you go back and you watch them now, there's not a lot of magic. There's not a lot of fantasy-esque stuff. It's basically set in ancient times, but a lot of it is just Arnold hacking things apart. That's kind of how things roll. There are some monsters, but it's nothing like what we've come to expect in fantasy since, with some of the movies that have come out more recently, like in this millennium, which have way better special effects and plots and the like. Back then, fantasy was completely uncool, and you could watch those movies, but then you called it a day and you went back to your real life. You didn't bring it into the real world. Anything like fandom was looked down upon. And then the 90s got even worse. The 90s were like a desert of fantasy. So after Willow came out in 1988, there was nothing on the horizon. And so I'm rolling into high school hoping they're going to make some X-Men movie or do something with Lord of the Rings, or something's going to come out. Nothing. Did anything come out in the 90s that was decent? What do my notes here say? Not really. The only thing that came out in the 90s was Dragonheart in 1996. And Dragonheart was okay. When I saw it with my ex-wife, she was super excited because it was a movie with dragons in it, and we didn't have those. They simply didn't exist. And it was mediocre. I remember seeing it and yeah, it was kind of okay. It had Sean Connery as the dragon, which was a huge draw, and a reason it did as well as it did. What did it go up to? Number 31 that year. So it did all right. It was in the top 50 at least, which is good for a fantasy movie, but that was it. And this was the 90s when we were getting sci-fi movies constantly that were amazing. Stargate came out, which was incredible. There were so many great science fiction movies. Independence Day that launched in the 90s. It was a massive genre, and regularly these science fiction movies were completely dominating at the box office. But nothing for fantasy. If you wanted epic fantasy set in a fantasy world with spells and sorcerers and magic and dragons, that just wasn't happening. We got all the way to the end of the decade, and nothing really touched that at all. It wasn't until 2001 when everything transformed and we entered what I consider to be the golden age of fantasy. So in 2001, two movies hit the scene at roughly the same time: Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. And Harry Potter took the top spot that year. So Harry Potter did better than Lord of the Rings. And this made sense because while Harry Potter has fantasy in it, while it has magic, it's grounded in the real world. You've got muggles, you've got some very recognizable elements. You can go see it and understand most of what's going on. Whereas with the fantasy world, everything's different. The history's different, the technology's different, the travel is different, the communication is different, the lore is different, the dialogue is radically different. You can't even speak the same way. And so that's harder on people who are not used to fantasy, and a lot of people weren't willing to dip their toe in until Lord of the Rings. By the next year, when The Two Towers came out, they were still releasing Harry Potter movies, but they had flipped places. So now Lord of the Rings was number one, and Harry Potter was number two. Harry Potter did great, and everybody loved it, but a fantasy movie took the top spot for the first time. And then the next year, in 2003, the Lord of the Rings trilogy came to its conclusion, and for the first time ever, a fantasy movie broke $1 billion. And it was only the second movie of all time to do it. So Titanic broke $1 billion, and then Return of the King. And that was it at that point. Once that had occurred, fantasy was cemented in the consciousness, the public consciousness, and it was cool. And I remember very much there being a shift. So for me, when I was dating, when you were dating in the 90s, it was hard to find other fellow geeks, and you didn't talk about it a lot, and I accepted that I probably would have to marry a non-geek. It was much harder to find them. But after that, everybody was kind of a geek, and it was growing as time went on. More and more people were geeks. More and more video games were fantasy-based. People were getting into graphic novels. Anime had made its way into the United States. Things like Record of Lodoss War came over that was very good fantasy. So people started to have more of it available, and we kind of entered the golden age. There was just an explosion of it, and I loved it. And that lasted till about, I don't know, maybe 2016 or 2017. What I'm basing that on, I'm thinking about Game of Thrones. So Game of Thrones came out in 2011, and this set the trend. For the first time in my life, and I'm saying that a lot in this video because there were a lot of firsts, for the first time in my life, a TV show that everyone was talking about was fantasy. And it was great because we as the geeks were not used to this. We're like, what? You guys are watching the same thing that we watch? Is that even possible? Like, how could you watch the same shows we watch? Because everything we watched flew under the radar. Nobody had ever heard of Farscape or Space Above and Beyond or all this stuff that we were super into. But they all knew Game of Thrones. Everybody was into it. We talked about it at the water cooler at work. My CEO at the company I worked at the time watched it. But, as we all know, the later seasons were lacking in some ways. They ran out of material from the books that George R.R. Martin had published, but even if they hadn't, if you're a fan of the books like I am, I've read these books so many times. The first 3 books in that series are incredible. They are artwork. They are amazing. The 4th and 5th, they're not as good. And I'm not saying they're terrible books by any stretch of the imagination, but they're not as good, and the quality was already falling in the novels. So if the quality was falling in the novels, it's unsurprisingly that they fell in this TV series. I think nobody expected them to fall as far as they did in that last season. And interestingly, how it fell tells me that we're leaving the golden age of fantasy. The problems in the last season of Game of Thrones that threw a lot of people like myself had to do with travel. In a fantasy world, you have to walk everywhere or take horses, and if there's blizzards, that impacts things. But lots of people think about fantasy worlds like the real world and take for granted that you can just hop on a 747 and fly across a continent in like 8 hours. And so we started seeing that, where armies would cross huge swaths of land instantly, and that really broke people's suspension of disbelief. And in fantasy, especially epic fantasy, you cannot do that. If you break suspension of disbelief, you lose a huge segment of your argument. And that's what the whole second part of this video, which we're going to jump into in a minute, is about. We're going to talk about what's changed in current fantasy, because the Wheel of Time really pissed me off bad. It really got under my skin. That series meant so much to me as a child and was so responsible for my development and me becoming an author. And to see how badly they've destroyed it, we're going to get into it, and I'll talk about what my problems with it are. It's a real privilege to have lived through the golden age of fantasy, and so we've sort of looked at a bit of it here, but it's over, and I'm hoping maybe there's going to be a reversal, but given everything that's come out in 2022, I'm thinking probably not for a while. All right, let's jump into the second half, and we'll see what's become a fantasy. So why is it that I think that we are no longer in the golden age of fantasy? I think that too many massive companies have tried to reproduce the success of fantasy classics like Game of Thrones, like Lord of the Rings, And they're hiring writers that don't understand fantasy as a genre. And they're approaching fantasy as if it was some flavor of science fiction or superhero or any number of TV shows that have dominated TV for a while. They're not approaching it like fantasy, and they don't understand what they're doing wrong. So, as an example, if an army is marching from point A to point B, it's going to take a long time to get there. The bigger the army, the slower it's going to go. If you have to sail, you're probably going to lose some of that army. As much as 40% might be lost in a storm. You never know. But you have to account for how that army is going to arrive. And that is a part of the tactics that military commanders in a fantasy setting are privy to. So if the military commanders are using those tactics, your reader is also using them. They are also aware of what's going on. They also know where the armies are. And so they're sort of planning these battles in their heads. So if you just teleport an army from the south all the way to where it needs to be in the north instantly, you've shown that you don't respect the rules of your own setting, and no one wants to read your setting if you don't respect the rules of your own setting. And there's a lot of faux pas you can make in fantasy to do this. One of them is things like travel or communication. You can't just call somebody on the phone and pass information. If you send a raven can't teleport, doesn't fly at 500 miles an hour. It's going to take it weeks to get where it needs to go if it's not killed on the way. You might have to send several ravens and maybe none of them get there. But if they do get there, it's going to be like a couple of weeks. If they had to get from the Wall down to King's Landing, we're looking at weeks for communication. And the show started treating it like they had instant messaging. And that was a real serious mistake, a faux pas. So fans start checking out. You lose more and more of your audience. Not all of them. Not everybody notices these things. But a lot of people do. And every time you trample on one of the conventions of a genre, you upset more people. The way that it happened for me in The Rings of Power, and this was the last episode that I watched, a hobbit said the word okay. If you aren't familiar with the etymology of the word okay, and you don't understand the difference between modern vernacular and fantasy vernacular, then it might not be clear why that's a problem. Because the word okay is very recent in the modern world. The word okay came from Martin Van Buren. He was part of something called Old Kinderhook. So these were the cool kids. They were in a club. Its name was Old Kinderhook. And so if you were cool, you were Old Kinderhook. You were okay. This is why you will often see it, the letter O period, then the letter K period, or sometimes you'll see OKAY. OKAY did not exist until after this word became a part of modern vernacular, and that happened in the 1800s. So if you're writing something set before that time period, you can't use the word okay. And if you're in a fantasy world, you can't use it at all. You have to replace it with something new. That's what world building is. That's our job as fantasy authors, is I have to make my own fantasy version of the word okay and use that. What a lot of my fans love the most is being able to see what is that world building, what is the language that you use, why did things develop the way that they develop in this fantasy world. They love knowing that. How does magic impact it? All sorts of questions like that. But the second I bring in something from the modern world, the real world, I've ruined it. It's no longer this wonderful fantasy world. It's now some amateur trying to tell a story poorly and not understanding what makes fantasy fantasy. And so when you see Amazon invest $1 billion into a TV show and then have that kind of writing, wow. This is going to sour a lot of people to fantasy, and people who really love it, they can't necessarily articulate why it's great. If you sit down on a Saturday morning and just start the extended versions of The Lord of the Rings, and you spend all day Saturday watching it, you're going to love it, but at the end of it, you're not going to say, I love that they honored the language, I love that the elves were different from humans, I love that the whole journey is something that Game of Thrones just casually flashed over in one episode. There's this internal consistency and honoring of the lore that makes fans want to stay and see more because they believe this is a living, breathing world and they want to know more about it. So you've got to keep that illusion and that suspension of disbelief. And the second you fail at that, you've lost your audience. Unfortunately, more and more shows are doing that. We'll jump into that and I'll talk specifically about The Wheel of Time and what I think they did wrong. And this is the one that I'll talk mostly about. I'm not going to go in depth into other TV shows. But The Wheel of Time really screwed some things up right from episode 1. They took an easy win of a story that was perfectly tailor-made for today and now is the exact right time to tell the story, and they butchered it utterly. So anyway, let's jump into that and we'll see how they did that. Okay, this is going to be fun. I've been waiting for a while to do this, and I've culled down like 3 hours of footage into like 5 minutes of complaints. So what do I think the Wheel of Time did wrong that made me hate watch it to the end of season 1 and then vow never to touch it again? They butchered the lore in unnecessary ways. So some of the changes that they made make absolutely no sense, didn't have to be made, and only weakened the show and the plot and only insulted and upset fans. So if they hadn't made these changes, fans would have been a lot less upset, and people who watched the show would have been none the wiser. So they would have taken a show that these fans already liked, and maybe they probably would have liked it a little bit more, but they would have kept the part of the audience like me who had read the books and were outraged by what had happened. And before we go any further, I want to say this. I had not read the Witcher books at the time that I started watching the TV show. So when I watched the first season, I thought it was great. I thought, this is amazing. This is really good, and it's good fantasy, and I'm excited about it. I hadn't played the games at that point, so it was my first exposure. But all of my friends who had read the books and had played the games were really upset and said that it was awful, and they really felt like it didn't honor the lore. Well, that's what you're going to get from me about the Wheel of Time. They didn't honor the lore, and the way that they changed it again make no sense. So the Wheel of Time is ultimately about the battle of the sexes and about them finding understanding that both of them need the other. Men need women, women need men. And, you know, in modern times, the reason why I think this is perfect is we have trans covered perfectly in this series, where just because you were born a woman doesn't mean that you're going to forever use the female side of the power. There's a couple of people who change genders and end up using a different side of the power than would normally match their gender. So again, it was like the perfect timing where it could really fit in with some issues that we're doing today. And they could have dealt with this in some great ways and maybe made a trans Aes Sedai, like, is built into the plot. If they just followed the books, you're going to get to the point where you reach that. Or you could have even accelerated it and gotten them, you know, earlier into book 1. But they can't do that based on the changes that they made to the plot. So in the books, the one power has 2 halves, saidar and saidin. Saidar is the female half of the power, and only women can use it. It involves submission. You have to surrender to the power. saidin is more like a raging river, and you can never surrender to it, and if you do, it'll destroy you immediately. That's the male half of the power. Why this matters so much is during the previous age, the Dark One escaped his prison, and then Lews Therin, the dragon, managed to seal him away. So he's a hero. He managed to seal away the Dark One. Yay, we won the war. But in the process, the Dark One tainted the male half of the power. He's like, cool, I'll just poison it. So every single male Aes Sedai went insane, and they tore apart the world in what is called the Shattering. So I've got an immediate problem here. So you've totally destroyed every fan of the books, because the first question we now have is, if the power is the same for men and women, why did only men go insane? They've now changed the power in the series so that men and women both have it, but men still somehow go insane for some reason. Later on in the books, and this is a minor spoiler, they cleanse the power. They're able to cleanse the male half of the power. Like, that whole plot can't happen now. They've managed to ruin so many things just because they look at the plot and say, we want it to be equal and inclusive. So we want men and women to be completely the same, so that we're just going to have the one power. And it breaks the plot. You've now taken every single person who's read the books and was into it and upset them. If that was all they had done, I could have overlooked it. We could have on board for it. I mean, I still love some things about the show, and I tried to focus on them. Nynaeve was a great positive for me. She's probably my favorite part of the show. She was one of my favorite characters in the books, too, and I love the actress that got to play her. So, like, there were some upsides. It was so cool seeing the one power and seeing Trollocs and stuff, but that's where my love ended. They broke so much of the rest of it, and I'm just going to go over a few of the characters that they ruined. So, in the books, Perrin didn't have a wife. Perrin was young. He was a blacksmith's apprentice. And it didn't start off with him killing anybody. He didn't begin by murdering his wife. Like, how messed up is that? So he murders his wife right off the bat. In the books, this was the lovable character. This guy's supposed to be less traumatized. Mat was a prankster, not a thief. So he might occasionally do a prankster, like he would go find a badger and then unleash it near some girls to scare them. Like that kind of stuff. He was not a thief stealing from people in a small town. Stealing from people in a small town is not cool. Not cool at all. They tend to put thieves to death or banish them or drive them out. So that change makes no sense at all. It's just not a good one. All of their parents have been butchered as well. Rand, his father, is one of the best swordsmen in the world. So like number 2 or 3 in the entire world. And he was the second in command of this massive army. So this is some spoilers. But I think they've abandoned it in the TV show anyway, so they probably won't work it in. But this is something that comes to light in the books. And this is why he has this heron-marked blade in a chest under his bed. Because he was a swordmaster who gave up his sword and went back to being a farmer so that he could raise his son Rand. In the books, this guy's amazing. All of the main characters' fathers were. So Egwene's father was a strong male figure. He was a great father and the mayor of the village. Perrin didn't have a father, but what he did have, Master Luhan, who was a smith, who trained Perrin, and that's how Perrin learned. So Mr. Luhan and his wife were kind enough to raise Perrin, and they were great. All of these were changed, and it's not clear why. So many of them were removed or just made terrible people. So Mat's dad is an example. In the books, Mat's dad is a horse trader. And he's known to be very honorable and fair. And he looks down on the fact that his son is not those things. In the TV show, they turned him into a deadbeat dad and a thief and a jerk. And this theme is common. You'll see it throughout the entire series. All of the male characters at every level, from the first episode through the last episode, have been gutted. Major parts of their personality are removed. The parts of the story that they did on their own have now been taken and removed and given to some of the women. So as an example, at the end of the first book, Rand al'Thor is the Dragon Reborn. And the Eye of the World is a huge pool of magical power. Rand uses this huge pool of magical power to annihilate the army of Trollocs that we see killed in the last episode, the one that Egwene kills. Keep in mind, Egwene has her own destiny and becomes mega powerful and has a great story, and she's one of my favorite characters in all of fiction, especially her ending in book 14. She's amazing. She's like the strongest part of the series, but for some reason, they need to make her stronger and tear down Rand and take away his abilities. The King of Shinar that they see is supposed to be completely subservient to Aes Sedai and would never in a million years insult them, be rude to them, anything like that. And of course, they made him be a jerk to Moiraine for no other reason than to just be a jerk. So they completely changed the culture of these characters of the North, of these people who honor the Aes Sedai because they need the Aes Sedai. They're fighting Trollocs and they're barely surviving, and they constantly have to deal with the armies of the Dark One, and the Blight is overwhelming them at all times. So they love the Aes Sedai. This is the one area of the world, the Borderlands, where Aes Sedai are treated well. And of course, they had to make the men be jerks. And I don't understand this. I don't get it. Every single strong male character was butchered. Like even Rand al'Thor. Rand in the books, you empathize with him because he was a good person and he was nice to everybody around him. In this show, he's whiny and he's mean to Egwene and he's just kind of petulant and pouty. They softened and ruined every single main character that was male. Lan is the best swordsman in the entire series, and he's got a wonderful character arc. But his whole deal is he has such bad PTSD that he can't show emotion or relate to anyone. And so him and Nynaeve begin to get together, but this takes many, many books, and it takes her until like the last book to finally break through and like help him heal internally and deal with his mental trauma. It's such a huge part of these books. And they turn this character into a warder who can't really fight. Like it takes him 20 minutes to fight one Trolloc when in the books he could cut down dozens of them easily. And B, there's a scene where he cries. I'm fine with men crying. I cry all the time. Lan does not cry. This dude would never cry. That's just not something he would do. And they butchered his character. And I don't understand why. So if you're a fan of this show, if you're watching this show, like the entire audience of people that read the books were like, peace out. Everybody left, and Rings of Power, as a result, suffered. So a lot of people don't seem to understand part of why Rings of Power did so badly when it came out is Wheel of Time fans wouldn't watch it. I will never touch anything fantasy related that they do again, because why would I? When I do so, I always regret it. I went in and I watched a couple of episodes of Rings of Power, and it was just as bad as I thought it would be. Like, they have lost the narrative, and this is going to really harm fantasy for years to come. You're going to see very few successful shows. You're going to see that lots of companies are going to be willing to make investments in large fantasy IPs because doing so is going to lose them so much money. The Witcher's going through this right now. Their whole spat with Henry Cavill, who honored the lore and had read the books and had played the games on hard mode apparently, which I could not do when I played it. I played it on easy. I'm not going to lie. they're butchering that as well. You know, they're pissing off that audience, and you can't do that. You can't write something that has generic dialogue that doesn't honor how fantasy is supposed to work with travel and communication, and then also doesn't honor any of the existing lore. You've lost the fan base of the books, and generic fantasy fans aren't going to follow that closely. And you are going to find some people that do follow it. I'm sure there's lots of people who love The Wheel of Time and are wondering why I'm so angry at that show. If you haven't read the books, then I could understand why you might like it. It could just be cool fantasy. But I see the agenda involved in what they're changing and why, and so do a lot of other fans, and we're tired of it. I just want to watch good stories. Both Dune and Lord of the Rings, the directors said the same thing. We tried to get ourselves out of it and just take the author's work and put it up on the screen, and Dune is my favorite new movie recently. Like, Dune was amazing. I even like the 1984 David Lynch version, but this one was wow. Like, everything looked the way I thought it should look from the books, and it was just amazing. Anyway, I hope we get a lot more of that. I hope that I get to watch the House of the Dragon, that I find that to be good, and that it's just like the first season of Game of Thrones, and maybe we do have some good fantasy alive. But I've been disappointed a lot lately. I'm afraid to watch Willow. I'm not even going to check out the new TV show, I think. I'm just like too hesitant. I've heard bad things about it, and even though I love the original movie, I've been burned too many times. So in the comments, by the way, if you've seen Willow, if it's any good, please let me know. Like, I'd love to watch it if it was. And I'd love to hear your opinions. Are you liking fantasy? Do you think I'm crazy? Are you a long-term fantasy fan? And if so, what do you feel about what's happening now? Because as someone who came up from the 1980s in fantasy and has loved it for all that time and has been reading books from all that time, I feel like we peaked around 2010, 2011, and by 2015, 16, 17, we're in a slide, and it's only been sliding since. I haven't seen anything in the last 5 years in the fantasy genre that was like, holy crap, that was amazing, and it's now gone on my short list of like absolute perfection in the way that early Game of Thrones did or that Lord of the Rings did. There we go. I'm drawing it to a close. This is my very long-winded rant on the state of fantasy. I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments. I'm going to get back to the writing, and I'll see you guys next week.